In the late 1980s, South Korea transformed vast stretches of farmland into thriving cities. Rice fields became places like Bundang and Ilsan, while millions of new homes rose at a pace that stunned the world. Few countries have reshaped their landscape so dramatically or learned so quickly how to build entire cities from scratch. In fact, this transformation formed part of the wider economic rise that became known as the Miracle on the Han River. So just how and why did South Korea embark on becoming one of the world's most experienced countries in large-scale housing construction? Well, in 1988, South Korea began its most significant national 5-year housing initiative to solve a severe housing shortage driven primarily by decades of rapid urbanization, population growth, and insufficient supply. The shortage also had deep roots in the destruction of the Korean War. Over the course of the 5-year housing program, more than 2 million housing units were built or put under construction, with the government reporting 2.14 million by the end of 1991, 1 year ahead of schedule. Behind those numbers were people who had spent their lives rebuilding through hardship, and few fit that description better than Chung Ju-yung. Chung was born in 1915 in Tongcheon, a farming settlement in what is now North Korea. He was the eldest of 7 children, and from the moment he was old enough to work, he did. On the farm mostly, while reading whatever newspapers came his way and dreaming of something bigger. At 16, he sold one of his father's cows to buy a train ticket to Seoul, but of course, his father tracked him down 2 months later and brought him home. At 18, he left again, and this time for good, finding work at construction sites before landing a job delivering rice for a Seoul shop. By 1937, the owner had handed the store to him, but again, things would not work out as the Japanese colonial authorities forced it to close 2 years later. Chung moved on to open an auto repair shop in Seoul in 1941, one that turned around in 5 days what other garages took 20. This business was born out of sheer desperation. He knew absolutely nothing about cars, so the Japanese military seized the shop and merged it with the steel plant. Chung moved on yet again. By this point, he had learned something important. When one business fails, just simply start another. But how does this all relate to housing in South Korea? Well, Chung would find his particular skill set very much in need. See, after Korea's liberation in 1945, he went back into auto repairs and then into construction, founding Hyundai Civil Works Company in 1947 with no particular reason to expect success. What he did have was a reputation for pushing projects forward and an almost pathological intolerance for delays. His skill set. He believed that most problems could be solved if people were willing to keep working at them. 3 years after the company was founded, the Korean War began. For 3 years, the peninsula was systematically destroyed. Seoul changed hands 4 times, and by the time the armistice was signed in 1953, millions of Koreans were homeless, and the cities had been badly destroyed. Chung fled to Busan during the invasion and watched the destruction from afar. And when he returned to Seoul, he found a ruined city and a huge amount of rebuilding to do. Hyundai started picking up contracts for this rebuilding process, though his early contracts were unglamorous. Access roads for U.S. military bases, drainage works, bridges, and other reconstruction projects. Not every contract went smoothly, but each one gave the young company experience it could carry into the next. Through personal connections and relationships with U.S. military engineers, Chung secured early work that other Korean firms couldn't reach. He built a reputation for difficult projects delivered on time, and then found ways to deliver faster the next time. His competitors thought it was reckless, and his engineers found it exhausting. They thought he moved too fast, took on too much, and didn't stop to think. However, government officials kept hiring him because they needed projects completed quickly, and Chung was one of the few contractors consistently delivering. But what about the housing that had been destroyed? Was he destined to only be responsible for unglamorous jobs? Well, yes, for a short while longer. By the early 1960s, South Korea was channeling that energy into something more deliberate. Under President Park Chung-hee, the government launched a series of 5-year economic development plans with construction at the center of every one of them. The Soyang River Dam, the Gyeongbu Expressway connecting Seoul to Busan, nuclear power facilities, deep water ports, the list goes on. Hyundai was winning a large share of all of it, and on every site, Chung kept asking the same question. Why does this need to take as long as it's taking? Construction delays are common almost everywhere in the world. In fact, many large projects end up taking much longer than originally planned. The standard answer across most of the global construction industry was that building structures takes time. Concrete cures at its own pace, because unlike paint or glue that hardens simply by drying out, it hardens through a continuous chemical reaction between cement and water, which slowly builds strength over several weeks. Structures need inspection, and skilled labor takes years to develop. In all honesty, these were real limits, and most builders accepted them. But the key idea was simple. Speed depends on planning the order of work ahead of time, so each task can start as soon as the last one finishes. Hyundai, under Chung's leadership, made it a central part of how projects were managed. The way materials move from supplier to site, and the decisions made in the planning phase, weeks before anyone picks up a tool, mattered. When those pieces are coordinated properly, projects move faster without requiring workers to do anything extraordinary. And it was at this same time, while Hyundai was hardening its methods on domestic infrastructure, that Seoul's population was beginning to swell. You see, Koreans were leaving rural areas for the capital throughout the 1960s, drawn by the factories, shipyards, and electronics companies the development plans had seeded across the country. Chung had watched this migration happen in real time because the roads his crews had built were now bringing people to Seoul, whose population grew from under 3 million in 1960 to more than 10 million by 1990, and all of those new residents needed housing. Hyundai was one of the companies that helped kick it off. Beginning in 1962, the state-backed Korea Housing Corporation developed the Mapo Apartments, the country's first large-scale modern apartment complex, with Hyundai participating in its construction. The complex was built in phases, including 6-story buildings completed in 1962 and 1964. Some units used central heating, while others used individual coal briquette heating. Grueling work that needed the kind of discipline and skill Chung had been instilling in his work. By 1972, the Housing Construction Promotion Act expanded state support and financing mechanisms for large-scale housing construction. 4 years later, apartment complexes were formally embedded in the Urban Planning Act. By the mid-1970s, 15-story towers were going up in the sandy fields south of the Han River, and what would eventually become famous worldwide as Gangnam. The river itself was being transformed at the same time, its banks cleared, parks laid out, highways built alongside it, as Seoul deliberately shaped what would become one of the most recognizable cityscapes in Asia. It was also in 1976 that Chung took on something that would test everything Hyundai had built up to that point. He had already started taking jobs abroad and won a contract worth around $930 million to build an industrial port in Jubail, Saudi Arabia. At the time, it was one of the largest construction contracts in the world, and Hyundai won it against bids from American, British, German, and Japanese firms, companies with decades of international mega project experience that Korean contractors simply didn't have yet. And Hyundai delivered. The experience Korean firms gained in the Middle East taught them lessons they couldn't have learned anywhere else. It was not only Hyundai, but hundreds of thousands of other Korean workers went to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain through the late 1970s and 1980s. They worked at enormous scale, in extreme heat, competing against contractors who had every structural advantage. Managing logistics at that scale, juggling dozens of moving parts across vast distances. None of it had a real equivalence back home, because the domestic projects simply hadn't been large or demanding enough to teach it. The projects were profitable as well, giving Korean construction firms more resources and experience with each new contract. South Korea's foreign exchange earnings from Middle East construction during this period ran into the billions of dollars, and much of it helped fund the next stage of South Korea's rapid development. Meanwhile, Seoul kept growing, and by the late 1980s, the gap between supply and need had become a political crisis. The economy had posted extraordinary growth figures through the decade, and housing was still lagging behind. Government approvals were running at roughly 200,000 new units a year. The number of people needing homes in Seoul and nearby areas was rising much faster than new housing was being built, and this resulted in prices going up sharply. This made it harder for working families to buy homes, while people who already owned property became even wealthier. Protests broke out, and pressure on the government kept growing. In response, President Roh Tae-woo's administration committed in 1988, the same year Seoul hosted the Summer Olympics, to building 2 million housing units in 5 years. In April 1989, the government added plans for 5 new satellite cities around Seoul to be built from bare fields within only a few years. This was a country binding national commitment with named locations and real deadlines. But as we already know, Chung had never been someone who saw a crisis and waited for someone else to solve it. He did not wait for the 1988 commitment to start preparing. Back in 1976, he had already separated Hyundai's housing operations into its own dedicated company, Korea City Development, which solely focused on building apartments at scale. By the time the government made its promise, Chung's organization wasn't scrambling to catch up. By now, Chung had the scale, the experience, and the methods to do something about it. Remember, at this point, South Korea had been building roughly 220,000 housing units per year. To reach 2 million homes in 5 years, construction would have to rise dramatically and remain at historically high levels. Government housing construction approvals rose to about 462,000 units in 1989 and approximately 750,000 in 1990. What was happening on those construction sites through the night and into the next morning relied on decades of experience the industry had built up since 1953, and Hyundai's crews were among the many public and private organizations contributing to it, turning their accumulated knowledge toward the satellite cities. Every lesson from every project fed into the next one. Chung's brother In-young's firm Hala Construction was working on the civil engineering side at the same time, laying infrastructure for major new developments. Across the wider program, planners, public corporations, contractors, and suppliers built systems that overlapped wherever possible to make everything run more efficiently. Yes, this included standardized floor plans, criticized at the time as an aesthetic compromise, but ended up making construction much faster and easier to repeat at scale. A crew that had just completed one building could move to the next and run the identical sequence without redesign or relearning. The planning methods developed in Korea and refined on Middle Eastern projects were now being used across dozens of sites at once. Prefabrication techniques reduced time-sensitive on-site work. Materials were ordered and prepared early, and suppliers were brought into the schedule, so deliveries arrived when they were needed. Workers who had come home from the Middle East with experience of genuinely large-scale operations trained the generation beneath them, and that generation trained the next. Bundang, Ilsan, Pyeongchang, Sanbon, and Jangdong, the 5 satellite cities, went from agricultural land to functioning urban communities with schools, parks, and transport links faster than most urban planners had considered structurally possible. By the end of 1991, the government reported that the wider program had reached 2.14 million housing units, achieving its numerical target 1 year early. The 5 new towns themselves continued developing through the mid-1990s. Tens of thousands of families who had been living in overcrowded Seoul apartments for years moved into new towers with proper heating and room for their children. This was one of the most tangible expressions of the miracle on the Han River. When people talk about it, they usually mean the GDP figures that soared, the shipyards, the semiconductor plants, and the leap from poverty to prosperity in less than 40 years. All of that is true, but the housing projects deserve just as much credit. Because for many ordinary families, this is what South Korea's economic transformation looked like in everyday life. Chung Ju-yung died in March 2001, and the small construction company he founded in 1947 had grown into one of the largest in the world. People often explain South Korea's development by talking about determination or national will. The reality was less dramatic, but arguably more impressive. Over time, Korean construction companies took on larger and larger projects, learned from each one, and gradually became capable of things that once seemed out of reach. Chung lived to see the 5 satellite cities become established urban communities. By the time he died, Bundang had supermarkets and subway stops and families who'd never heard his name. They didn't need to. His contribution to South Korea's housing construction sector helped make its building industry one of the most experienced in the world. And Korea wasn't the only country to battle traditional and modern methods of house building. Japan struggled with this for decades. Click the video on the screen to learn just how incredible their building history is.